Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. The intersection of food and religion is an area in which I've lately been taking more and more interest. These areas of interest sprung up a few years ago when, as a high school religious studies teacher, my students began asking questions during our studies in Buddhism's Eightfold Path. The students, who lived in a college town with bars everywhere, began asking questions such as, if serving alcohol can increase the suffering of someone for the profit of others, where does the Buddhist teaching of right livelihood come into play for Buddhist bartenders? Another great one relates to the Bodhisattva vows, where a Buddhist says, beings are numberless, I vow to save them. The students would read this and, leapfrogging from their questions on right livelihood, jump to questions of right action and the Bodhisattva vows and say, how do Buddhist cooks and chefs who vow to save all sentient beings deal with the ethical dilemmas of preparing and serving meat in restaurants? These questions, asked largely by sharp and thoughtful but decidedly non-vegetarian teenagers in Missouri, have stuck with me for a long time. This episode is a conversation which touches on these issues, discusses cooking styles in Buddhist monasteries, and more. I'm delighted to welcome arguably the perfect guest to discuss such matters, Chef Eric Ripert. Eric Ripert is chef and co-owner of Le Bernardin on 7th Avenue in Manhattan's Theater District. He is the author of the Autobiography, 32 Yolks, From My Mother's Table to Working the Line. He is the author of numerous cookbooks, and he is also the host of the television series AVEC Eric. In 1989, Ripert moved to the U.S. to work as sous chef at the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. And in 1991, Ripert moved to New York, where he eventually came to be chef for Le Bernardin. Ripert is constantly recognized as one of the top chefs in the world. However, the topic of today's conversation picks up where his autobiography left off, and we discuss how his profession and his Buddhist practice merges and how they inspire each other. As a viewer of Ripert's television appearances, his series AVEC Eric, and a recent reader of his autobiography, it is a privilege and pleasure to bring you this conversation on the intersection between Buddhism and the restaurant industry with one of the world's most notable chefs, Eric Ripert. Eric spoke to me in the middle of his workday from the conference room at Le Bernardin, and I am deeply grateful to him for taking the time to talk to me. Enjoy our conversation. Chef Eric Ripert, welcome to Classical Ideas. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be with you.
So it is because of the extraordinary artist Rima Fujita that we are sitting here together today. Rima and I have become friends over the last few months, and she calls you her best Dharma friend. Can you tell me a little bit about your friendship with Rima and some of your Dharma adventures that you two have had together?
Sure, I know Rima for a long, long time because of the beauty of her art that inspires so many people, and I was very attracted to what she paints and creates. And I have seen Rima many, many years ago in many occasions with Tibet House and Tibet Fund and Tibetan events that support the community in exile or anything that supports the Tibetan community in that aspect. And then in terms of adventures, I think the biggest adventure that Rima and I had was to do a pilgrimage together, following the footsteps of Shakyamuni Buddha, starting in India, ending up in Nepal, in Lumbini, where Buddha was born. So it was not necessarily chronological, but we started in Varanasi, and then we went to Bodh Gaya, and from Bodh Gaya we went to Vulture Peak, where Buddha delivered the sermon of Heart Sutra, and it was 2 weeks together in India with another friend, and that was probably the most crazy adventure that we ever did together.
I love it. You mentioned Tibet a little bit. Do you as a Buddhist most closely identify with the traditions of Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes, I do, because when I started to be interested in Buddhism, it was in 1989, and then in the 90s a bit more, and then it grew. However, the main factor for me to have interest in Buddhism was His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he just at the time got the Peace Nobel Prize, and I was so inspired by his acceptance speech that I certainly was very curious about who he was, what he represented, what Buddhism was, and therefore he was basically, through book, my first influence / teacher, and I put a lot of effort into studying Vajrayana, and not so much learning from the Theravada tradition or Zen tradition. And then when I did have some interest in Zen tradition, I was a little bit confused. So I went back to Vajrayana, and which is, as you know, a part of the Mahayana tradition.
Yes, absolutely. So that's kind of like where you feel the most comfortable over the last 30 years of practice.
Yes.
Excellent.
And I feel comfortable, and also it's something that I like very much. I like the tantric aspect of it, of the teaching, that you don't find necessarily in Zen Buddhism. And it's something that is basically very appealing to me, almost like tailored to what I like in terms of style of studying and learning, and it's in sync with my beliefs.
Excellent. Okay, so as we were talking about a little bit off air, just a few minutes ago off air, you have a very hectic life, and not only are you like an entrepreneur and a traveler, but you also have a committed Buddhist practice. So as a person who lives such a hectic life, I'd love to know a little bit about what your Buddhist practice looks like on any given day. Like, do you have any routines that you need to do in order to feel okay about the state of your spiritual practice?
Sure. Hectic life, I don't know if it's hectic. It's a busy life.
Yeah.
Hectic is when it's chaotic. Busy is when it's organized chaos, I guess.
Oh, good.
So I like to make to make that distinction in between hectic and busy. But yes, I have a routine, of course. I wake up early. I wake up at between 6 and 7 in the morning. I have my coffee, and then after that, I go to my meditation room, and I have some rituals. Then I recitate mantras. Then I do offerings. Of course, I take refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha. That's the first thing I do in the morning. But after that, I do what I just described. And then after the meditation, I study a little bit every day by reading books, by listening to some teachings. And then once a week, I have the luck to have a dear Dharma friend who doesn't want me to call him his teacher because he's too humble, but he's a geshe, which means he has a doctor in Buddhist theology, and he's Nepalese and Tibetan, and his name is Tashi, so he's Geshe Tashi, who comes every Thursday to my house, and we have 2 hours of teaching and learning for me from him, and that's very helpful. When I'm done with all that, I come to work and I make sure that I don't take transportation, and therefore I walk through Central Park, and it's basically another kind of loose meditation. It's not like a walking meditation that Zen practice will recommend, but it's close to that.
Yeah, I love following your Instagram posts as well because you're really regular about frequently posting photos of your walks to work every day in Central Park, and it's really beautiful to watch the seasons change and see your mood in the photos. Like I can tell that you're in a really good place when you're walking to work every day.
Oh, for sure. And also, to be in contact with nature, it's very powerful, and it's a very great exercise of mindfulness because you're really in the present of what's happening with the rhythm of nature.
Do you struggle at all with gaps in your practice or lapsing due to your busy schedule?
Well, if I could, I would practice much more and I will meditate much more. But I think I'm fine. I'm pretty content with the schedule and rhythm that I have. The challenges are when I'm traveling. It's very difficult in between. Sometimes being jet lagged, sometimes being on a different lifestyle than when I am at home. Traveling for me is definitely where I struggle the most to practice or to study, like I like to do at home. Meditation for me is very difficult in a plane. I know a lot of my friends love being in a plane and meditate. It's for me, as soon as I walk into a plane, I sleep, so it's not good.
Gotcha. Well, let's talk a little bit about your traveling and adventures. I want to specifically talk about an episode of AVEC Eric that I really enjoyed recently. And I'd love to discuss your experience documented in the episode when you spent time learning about temple food at Baekhyang-sa Buddhist Temple in Korea.
Yes.
Why did you pick this particular temple for filming this episode of AVEC Eric?
We were scouting the country and looking at many temples, and there are a lot of them. Some of them very small, and others pretty big with few hundreds or sometimes 1,000 monks in it. And we liked that one because it was the monks on one side, and it was a beautiful surrounding, and then it was this small hermitage, like 5 minutes walk from the monks, where few nuns were living, and John Kwan, who ends up in the episode, is the head nun of that hermitage, and she's in charge of cooking and teaching temple food.
Excellent. I love the episode, and Zheng Quan, her methods are really fascinating. What do you, as a chef, most admire about the monastic food preparation that you learned about?
Many things. First of all, I mean, for John Kwan, it's, of course, she's feeding people, but it's a practice. Everything is a practice in a process, from cultivating the plants in a garden. And in those monasteries, especially in Korea, it's very important for the monks to be involved with not only the cooking aspect, but also planting the seeds, cultivating the garden, be in constant relationship with the plants. And then they of course cook its vegan diet, and it's a meditation during the process. It's a meditation when you eat as well, and a lot of rituals linked to the process of eating the food that has been prepared. So I like all of that, and I find it fascinating, and it's something that is absolutely entirely sustainable in a point of view of respecting the planet, of course, avoiding suffering for animals, and sustainable because they feed themselves with their own resource.
Yeah, and another lesson that I took away from the episode is when you say temple food not only nourishes the body, but it also purifies the mind. So, what were some of the biggest lessons that like you took away from your experience with Zhang Quan and her temple food? Is it all about it? Like, you could elaborate as well if you wanted to on like, you just mentioned the benefits to the planet, but what were some of your biggest takeaways from the experience in its total?
It's massive, the takeaway.
Yeah.
It was the first time I was exposed to temple food, and I was fascinated by the idea of planting the seeds, working the soil, being one basically with the universe, and being so mindful of the life of the insects and animals that are interacting with the garden. For instance, when they harvest anything, they make sure that there's no insects on the leaves or on the vegetables. They let the wild boar come to the garden and eat part of the garden. They share everything with the surrounding. That was, to me, an eye-opener. I was like, wow, they are so careful, mindful, and compassionate in the process of doing that. Then, of course, they use traditional techniques and techniques that I didn't know that I learned there, but just domesticating the fire, making sure that you don't burn too much wood. You are cautious with the amount of trees that are being cut, that you are in constant relationship with that fire was also something fascinating to me, because in a Western world, especially in urban centers and in professional kitchens, we basically turn a button or push a button, and then the heat comes either way through electricity or gas. This is something that is very important and again, a great mindfulness exercise. Then what was fascinating was how good the food was.
Yes.
And how pure and powerful the flavor were. And at the same time, what was very interesting was how I felt after eating. Your mind is very clear. The food that they provide help them to be very, very focused in their meditation and practices, to sleep extremely well when it's needed, and to be very healthy. And I will give you an example that is fascinating to me, is that, for instance, at the end of the summer, beginning of the fall, they harvest, or they have harvested a lot of vegetables and leaves and so on that have been in contact with the sun. And therefore the energy of the sun has penetrated those ingredients, and they preserve them if they have to for the winter. But then when it's extremely cold weather in that region, they are eating those ingredients that are basically not only delicious, but are medicinal. And the energy of the sun prevents them from getting the cold, which sounds logical, right? And I think we have lost this awareness about eating and the relationship with the seasons and the elements that can help us to have a meaningful diet in terms of, again, awareness and health.
I agree, and what's interesting about the episode is immediately after I watched your episode with Zhang Quan, I was in my kitchen cooking food, and I'm cracking open cans of diced tomatoes and things like that, and it was coming out of cans, and I couldn't help but think about the stark contrast that I had just seen within your episode and the lifestyle of Zhang Quan in the temple. So it was just a moment where I had to, I took away a lesson from that, thinking about the distinctions and the way that we appreciate and think about food around the world. It was just a powerful, beautiful moment for me.
Yeah, it's very powerful. And also for the person who's cooking to feed others, it's an amazing practice of generosity and practice of compassion, of course. And it's a daily practice for them. So it's it's really a lifestyle attached to the temple food that is very powerful and is their practice.
Yeah, and Zheng Quan thanks the food in the episode. And in the West, there seems to be sometimes like there are prayers before meals, but thanks are often to like the Lord and not to the food itself. Do you think that Westerners could learn a little bit about gratitude to food based on the episode that you put out for AVEC Eric?
Definitely, yes. Most of the Westerners who are thanking the Lord are very often Christians or Muslims or Jewish, so therefore they believe in one God.
Right.
I do not see too many Buddhist people thanking the Lord, but they thank basically the universe, and very often I see them paying homage and are grateful to the ingredients that are presented to them, even if it's vegetables or vegetarian or vegan or using animal. They are very grateful to either way the life of the animal that has been sacrificed for the meal, and very thankful for the plants for letting them be harvested. And actually John Kwan in her garden thanked the plants when she harvests the plants. And then she thanked them again when she's cooking, and she thanked them again when she's eating.
So some of the things you were just talking about, like, bring up ethics within Buddhism, and something that springs to mind is your connection to the Eightfold Path as a restaurateur, as a chef. And I want to talk about a couple of issues on which I am like genuinely undecided. So I'm a high school teacher, and I have had past students point out the tension that might exist for Buddhist chefs and restaurateurs who serve meat or alcohol, and in relation to the Eightfold Path of right livelihood, right intention. And I read an interview with you in Tricycle in 2010 where you wrestled with this dilemma. Have you made any progress on your views with regards to right livelihood and serving meat and things like that?
Yes, I have made some progress. I am more conflicted than ever.
Right, yeah, no, it's confusing.
It's confusing. Now, let's start with the easy one, the
Sure.
alcohol, right? So restaurateurs, bartenders, nightclubs, and people who operate those outlets, and even people who are producing alcohol at the source, which means winemakers and people creating alcohols and so on. They have a right livelihood, most of them. In Buddhism, we said, do not get intoxicated. Buddhism doesn't say, do not drink. And when you are a restaurateur or a bartender and you're serving clients, you are not responsible for their decisions. They are free to take the alcohol and drink it moderately and have an experience, or it's their decision to not be moderate and do something that is stupid, which is to get drunk and intoxicated. Now, the intention is very important in Buddhism, as you know.
Yeah.
If your intention is to get your client drunk and to make a lot of money from it, therefore you're doing something wrong. If your intention is to complete a certain experience and to make sure that your client is not smashed at the end of the experience, I don't think you're doing something that is wrong. Again, it's about the intention. A doctor who gives medicine to someone doesn't know if the person is going to overdose from the medicine. If his intention is to give medicine, we can take a topic that is very hot right now, right? Painkillers. Yeah. If a doctor gives a certain painkiller to a patient and in his mind is to mislead the patient and to be greedy and make money from that product, therefore it's bad. If the intention of the doctor is to alleviate the pain from that patient and try to do the right thing for his patient, is a good thing. And now when you talk about the patient, if the intention of the patient is to take as many painkillers as he can and as many times as he can to be intoxicated, then it's wrong. But if the patient is taking the prescription the right way and it's beneficial for him, so it's the same thing with the alcohol that is being served. Bars and restaurateurs and bartenders and restaurateurs and operators in a food and hospitality industry very often do not let their clients drink too much. At the restaurant, when we see someone being alcoholized or starting to be drunk, we stop serving alcohol. We do not push the client to go too far.
That's great. Yeah. And, you know, a story springs to mind. I had back surgery a few years ago, and my doctor was extremely ethical and careful with regards to giving me a full description of the warnings about the drugs that he was giving me during my recovery period. So his intention was absolutely clear with me as my doctor and as my caretaker.
Yes. And also, you know, you have some very pure minds, like monks, who drink alcohol in different traditions, including in Buddhism. If you go to Japan, they drink alcohol. In Tantra, sometimes they drink alcohol. However, if you see a monk drunk, is something wrong, obviously. But again, it's about the intentions and it's about being in control yourself, and nobody can do that for yourself.
So how do you feel about meat then?
Well, Le Bernardin is specialized in seafood, so we don't serve too much meat. However, I'm always very, very concerned about the suffering of the animals. And it's something that I'm really struggling with. I started to be a chef before I became a Buddhist. And I never thought about the animals suffering on the beginning of my career. And even when I started to become a Buddhist, I never thought about the suffering of the animals. And even today, I myself eat a diet that is not vegan nor vegetarian. I eat meat and fish. I eat more vegetables, for sure. And I'm inspired to help animals to suffer less. But the reality is that even if I was saying, okay, Le Bernardin is becoming a vegan restaurant, and try to inspire people, what will happen today is that Le Bernardin will close because it's not enough support from the clients, and it will not make any difference in the world because it will be one less restaurant. I think our society and the way we are living our life, it's not evolved, and we are not ready yet to make the drastic change to switch our diet from animal protein to simply a vegan diet, like in temple food. And even vegan people very often cannot sustain that diet because their DNA doesn't allow them to be healthy. A great example is Holiness the Dalai Lama tried many times to go on a vegan diet, and his doctor had to take care of him because he was getting sick, and they recommended to him to have some meat. So again, to feed people for their pleasure animals that have suffered, it's something that I struggle with. When I have tremendous compassion for those animals that have died for us, and very often when I see the products in a restaurant, I make a prayer, and I light candles every year and every day for the suffering of the animals. but I'm torn. I don't know what to do until I potentially close the restaurant.
Yeah.
Am I going to? We have 175 employees. Am I going to close the restaurant and have 175 employees losing their jobs? Some entire communities of fishermen live from catching fish. Are we going to stop that? Yes, we can, of course, but it's very difficult today to do that.
Yeah. And recently I read your book, 32 Yolks, your autobiography, and through something that struck me is I'm thinking about you running your restaurant and the way that you manage your restaurant and your staff. I was really touched by everything you just said about caring for your employees. And throughout your younger years, you write in the book in great detail about how you struggled with some anger. And I'm curious if Buddhism really plays a role in your management style in your restaurant to keep your employees happy, to keep yourself happy and content, and how those two worlds mix. Like, how does Buddhism influence your management of Le Bernardin?
Sure. I'm now 54 years old, but when I was young, I was a young chef with a bad temper. And I was educated in kitchens where chefs were very angry at their staff and very abusive, verbally mostly, but sometimes physically by beating them, kicking them in the butt, punching them in the shoulders, throwing plates, and so on. And when I started my career, I was basically emulating some of my mentors. And I realized that I was miserable in my life. People around me were miserable, and we were not productive. What we were doing was just, we were suffering from anger or from the consequences of anger. And one day I was home reflecting on my misery and the misery of the company, and I realized that ultimately it was coming from me, from my negative attitude toward the staff. And I changed that, not overnight because it takes time, but I changed that through practice. And the way I bring what I learn in Buddhism to the restaurant or in my life, when I share with people, it's in a secular way. I'm not trying to convert anyone to Buddhism. I'm not trying to even talk about Buddhism with them. What I try to do is to take the universal values of Buddhism and apply them at the restaurant. For instance, I will say, treat others the way you want to be treated. And that resonates in the mind of many people, actually, even in the Bible. And I think it's where you have the most success is when you don't talk about religion, when you don't talk about your practice, but when you lead by example, and when you are saying things that are secular but make total sense. And when we have meetings and you say to your staff, we have to try to make our environment the best for us to blossom and have young people be inspired and so on. This is a message that is secular, but ultimately for me, the influence comes from Buddhism.
I was curious about the absence of Buddhism in 32 Yolks. Like, you mentioned Shunryu Suzuki Roshi and you mentioned Tibet, but only very briefly within the final few pages. Was there a reason that you omitted a lot of Buddhism from the autobiography?
Yes, because I was not exposed to Buddhism. I didn't know what it was. My family is Catholic. I was baptized. And then I went to Catholic school. I had a bad experience. But that experience didn't really push me into Buddhism. I was just not satisfied with the dogma of the Christianism. And I'm not judgmental here. A lot of people accept the dogma, and that religion has a lot of positive influence on those people. But for me, it didn't work. I didn't understand the logic of that religion, and I was struggling with it. And I can give you an example. I didn't understand Adam and Eve and the snake and the apple, and
sure.
to me, it didn't make any sense. Therefore, I was conflicted, and I was looking for guidance, spiritual guidance, unconsciously and consciously. And until the end of my book, which is when I'm leaving France, and it's my last few minutes in France before I board the plane to come to America, I have no idea what Buddhism is. I have no idea who the Dalai Lama is. I'm going to discover that in the plane, and when I land in America, it's when I'm really discovering Buddhism.
Excellent. I'm curious about a method of cooking or a dish that you never would have found had you not become a Buddhist. Like, have there been any practical applications into your craft that Buddhism made possible?
Well, it's not necessarily in one dish, but it's more powerful than that. For instance, at Le Bernardin, as I mentioned previously, I struggle with the suffering of the animals that we serve. Last year, we decided to have a tasting menu that is vegan. And we put a lot of effort into the creativity of this menu. And we, of course, update this menu with the seasons and so on. And people can come today to Le Bernardin and have a vegetarian or vegan experience and be with their friends who are eating fish or meat if they wish. So this decision was influenced by Buddhism. I'm working right as we speak. I'm looking at the board right now in a conference room where we are working on a vegetarian book. It's going to be called Vegetable Simple or Vegetarian Simple. But that book will be ready in 2020. And I'm working on this book because of Buddhism influence. I want to use all my talent and the talent of the team and our creativity to create recipes that are simple, that are inspirational, and that are delicious ultimately for people to cook more vegetables. So therefore, Buddhism had an influence and has an influence today in my career more and more and more. Probably one day when I'll be ready, I will open a vegetarian restaurant. And it's not tomorrow, but in a few years from now, I totally see myself being involved in such a project, or even create a wellness center where people could come and rejuvenate or rest and make some retreats and so on. That will be not a Buddhist center, but a secular environment that allow people to be exposed to, again, more or less the same experience that I had in temples myself, but without going to a temple and without being converted to Buddhism.
Excellent. So as you look down the next few decades of your life, what are some of your goals for the next couple of decades with regards to Buddhism? What are you still hoping to achieve within your own practice?
Well, it's very simple. Wisdom of emptiness, which brings to enlightenment, and it is for the benefits of all sentient beings. That's the Mahayana practice, that's the Vajrayana practice. All the efforts that I'm making, all the learning experience, everything that I'm gaining from the masters that have passed the teaching ultimately to myself, I'm trying to use that to make a difference in the world and to be a better human being, and to have an impact on the community as much as I can. A positive impact, obviously. The intention is to help every sentient being until we finally can, all of us, leave samsara and attain nirvana. And samsara and nirvana, it's not two worlds that are esoterical. They are anchored in our consciousness. It's a switch of consciousness. Nirvana is when you attain wisdom of emptiness, and suddenly you want to leave the state of being in a samsara.
Could you see yourself doing a follow-up to 32 Yolks that has more Buddhism within the chapters? Could you see yourself doing a follow-up?
Not at this point.
Okay. Well, and I really do look forward to checking out your vegetarian cookbook as well that you're working on, because that's primarily what I cook at home. So that is something that will immediately impact my own practice with my wife and my daughter in my own house. So I will be watching for that.
It's coming in the spring 2020, in a year from now. It will be available, and I'm very happy that you will be potentially inspired to cook some of the recipes.
Excellent. Well, Chef Eric Ripert, I am very grateful to you for taking some time out of your schedule today. I know that you're at work and things are happening as we speak. So thank you so much for being here and talking to me on Classical Ideas about the intersection of food and Buddhism.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be on your podcast, and grateful as well. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to express myself. I appreciate very much. Thank you.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybig. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.